I work with Women of Grace, but mostly I'm really interested in soul care. My husband is a counselor, and we do a lot of marriage counseling together and ministry in other ways together.
Thank you. And you spell it V-I-K-I.
Yes.
Why don't you have a common name like
Scandinavian.
Oh.
I mean, I love Scandinavian names.
Yeah, okay, good.
My name is
That's
Sven.
enough. Your time is up.
My name is Sven.
You can't even say it.
My name's Ed Lewis, and I spend most of my year in inner city Philadelphia and living in the inner city, and I go back and forth here, and I work here at CE National as is already mentioned before. So I go back and forth, but most of the time I live in actually a little apartment on the corner of A and Tioga, and highest concentration of illegal drugs there. We have graffiti, we've got all kinds of stuff, and I love what I'm doing over there in inner city Philly.
Great. Thank you for doing it. Here we go. Quick answers, and anybody can raise your hand and say, what do you mean by that? What strikes you as something you should start after today? Forget Tim, you guys.
Oh, I'm just saying. I think one of the things that came to my mind, I really appreciated, Tim, what you were doing today, because I feel like you're dealing with something that is really at the heart of the whole matter of where we are in our own spiritual walk. And I think that's where all of us, I have to keep coming to this. I can be involved in ministry, but if I'm not really living for God, and if I'm really doing this, it doesn't count for anything. But at any rate, one of the things that I came back from, I feel like I need to strengthen my prayer life more. And you didn't even focus strongly on that, except it was one of the areas that came by, and I felt like that was good for me to hear. I do a thing where he's kind of funny because he talks about exercise and all this different thing. But when you can tell my prayer life, because my prayer life is connected to my exercise. When I exercise, I always pray. So I'm just going to say, so if the prayer isn't happening, it's because I'm not exercising. But as I'm doing stretches every morning, I do all these stretches and I do this kind of stuff. But while I'm doing this, I go through a whole list of 10 different things, different people I'm praying for, different ministries I'm praying for. But if I don't do that on a consistent basis, then my prayer life drops. So I need to work on it.
Viki, what should you start doing?
I want to start taking a nap.
Not a bad idea.
No, I grew up in a culture where there is an afternoon nap every day. And when talking about rhythms and peaks and troughs and all of that, I grew up with that rhythm, and it's hard for my body to not function on that rhythm.
Good.
I can add to something just on that one. Sometimes when I'm driving along, because I drive back and forth, I take a nap. No. But I do believe in power naps. I do believe if I'm getting tired and I do something, I just pull over the side of the road, and I'm serious. Within 10 to 15 minutes, I am fine, and I go back and travel again.
John Kennedy he's the president once. John Kennedy made famous the 12-minute nap. Anybody ever read that? Every day he took a 12-minute nap. And I also read, and I like this even better some days, that if you let your head go down and whenever your pen drops, you've had enough, and that refreshes your body. And that's unbelievable, but it's true. I've done that while I'm preaching. All right, panel, here we go. Again, right to the point because of time, and then we want to get your questions. What good is an accountability partner or a group? Here we go. Right to it.
I've found, especially lately, that the accountability partners that I've had for about 7 years have really helped me out. And because they know my history, they know what I've been struggling with all along. The last 6 months have been very difficult, and they've been able to help me sort through, am I handling this right? They know my heart and they know my history.
They're all women.
Yes.
3 or 4?
3.
3 total.
Yes.
Good. Ed, anything?
Just going to say, accountability, I think what we do, we have generic accountability with CE. When we have meetings, our executive staff times, I would say that even within a local church, we ask occasionally, we'll go, I mean, almost every time we'll have a meeting, we'll say, well, you can ask somebody else in the meetings an accountability question. And it's something, whatever you want to do. We're just going to say, what's going on with your life? Are you morally pure? Are you, what's going on? Are you any relationship problems? We do that on a regular basis whenever we have executive staff meetings and what we're doing at CE. But I also have groups of people that I meet with over at Urban Hope that are also accountability partners. I meet with them, and we really are honest and open with each other, dealing with all kinds of things in our lives.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
And I know about the five of you on the phone or in
Yeah.
the conference. You're still the boss.
Yeah, I still am, but I think that at that aspect of it, but I'm also vulnerable to the fact that I need to be honest and open and let them know, and that's what I think Tim was saying today. I'm still the boss, but I have to do that, but I have to also at the same time admit that if I'm not doing well and I need to make changes, I think it's a good place to be able to share that.
I do too. It still is limited. None of them has ever said, I'm having trouble at work. I hate my boss.
Well,
Tim, what about accountability?
I would just bring up the bad side of accountability. If it needs to be consistent, whether that's once a month or once a week. I've found that weekly accountability is a little overwhelming. Yeah. Monthly accountability has worked better for me. But if it gets so focused on a sin and that's all you talk about, then it reduces the person to a bad behavior. And so I like the questions to be broader. What's God been teaching you? What's been encouraging? So you do ask those questions if someone's struggling with pornography or something, like how's your struggle been going? How have you been experiencing victory? But avoiding just the more legalistic or narrow kind of questions and getting a broader look at things too.
And, someone wrote a study once of pastors who have fallen, and a conclusion was they were loners. I don't think I was always in an accountability group, but I could still lie or mostly hold back. But there is a point about being alone and alone all the time in terms of real candor. And a church I'm coaching right now, the pastor just had to resign, and to a man, his board went around and said, I thought you were close to him. I thought you were close to him. And he had drifted away from everybody, including me. It's a great reminder to me, to all of us.
Let me add one more thing, and I'm just going to say that is effective. If a person is not living a moral life, they're probably also not going to be truthful. Yeah. So, but you can ask the questions, at least anyway.
John Wesley's Holy Club had 7 questions, and the 7th one was, have you just lied to us? Like you're going to lie for 6 and then say on the 7th one, yes, I have, but I'm not telling which one. Come on. All right, let's have this debate. I'm ready to go at you, Tim.
Okay.
Comment on both sides of the question. Does sermon prep count as devotions?
Well, 2 thoughts. First of all, I have often wrestled with the idea of a devotional time. I even had it up on the screen. I want my whole life to be devotional. So if we can get past that, and worship is more than a song.
We're not
okay.
legalists. Yeah.
Okay, we're beyond that. But as far as the sermon prep, I want it to speak to my heart, and I want it to be encouraging. I just know next week I'm going to have to do another one, and next week I'm going to have to do another one. And there is a bit of a treadmill that you're trying to keep going with sermon prep. So I want God to slowly, thoughtfully speak to me at a different area in my life than just what the sermon has to say. So that's why it's important to me. So I can slowly go through. I just finished Romans and read through it multiple times and read a book to go along with it that has nothing to do with my preaching, but it has my mind thinking about Romans and God. So,
and mine is a little different than that. Mine is, and I've been doing that for numbers of years, but I read through the Bible every year, if you're going to do that kind of stuff. And so every year I'll try to get a new Bible, so that keeps me going, different versions, different stuff like that. But then every night, that's when I would normally do that. So I keep it totally separated out from anything else that I'm doing. Doesn't mean that I'm not praying, doesn't mean that I'm not seeking God if I'm getting sermons ready or I've got something that has to be done. But I just feel like there is something that I need to be working on, and then I journal and do some things with that to try to work with it.
I don't do sermons, but I teach classes. But I've found, because my background is in communications, I found that if I read the Bible thinking about what do they need to hear, then I'm not allowing it to penetrate my own mind, and I can easily compartmentalize. So I have to make sure I have my devotional times in addition to any prep.
I had two things, and one is whoever said there has to be devotions. And all I'm saying is I was brought up legalism 20 minutes a day, or if you can't check it here, and that can be rote. But at the same time, all I want to emphasize is when I do study, let it hit my heart. You're not arguing with that. Yeah. And still other things just for myself, I agree. It has helped me for many years to make myself kneel when I pray and not ask for anything 3 times a week. That sounds corny. But I'm so easily praying for needs in the church or for next Sunday's sermon or for today's sermon or whatever, that just to worship and kneel as a picture has been a help to me all my life. It has been a help to me to pray with my wife, and we both pray every evening meal. And when I go out for lunch, if I'm with Ed, I think I'll say, I just started this with other people, but let's both pray, and then we can both pray for each other. It's just something, a little bit of a bond to pray for another. But with my wife, we're home alone now, except when Ed comes home. And he left home when he was 2, which was like 20 years ago. Any comments on that from anybody? It's not a contest. The point is, my point, I'm being defensive, I think, is when you're studying, just say, what does this say to me? Let this change my heart first, or it won't even show in the pulpit. Okay, what helps you pray other than your own needs?
I would say, I keep in my own apartment over there, I have a whiteboard, and we put a list on there, 10 most wanted people we want to see become believers, who are new believers that we're following up, who are guys on the corners that we're praying for, who are those that are connected to health issues, what are dealing with financial areas. And I keep a whole list, and when teams come over to Urban Hope, we give them whiteboards, and we say, when you go back, we want a whiteboard to be given, not to pray for people in Philadelphia. I want you to pray for the lost people and for the hurting people in your own community. I will not spend all my time, and I think that we waste our time in our churches when all we're doing is praying for the health needs and for everybody else's issues. We need to be, and here's another thing that relates to this. If you came to Philadelphia, we would be praying, you would see this. We will pray for the people of Philly. We don't pray for the people in Africa. Don't get me wrong, occasionally we do that. But I feel like I am in that area because that's where God put us. And we need to be praying for the people in our community primarily. Yes, we pray for people elsewhere, but our concentrated effort is our church, our lost people, our neighbors, our people in our church, not just spending so much time that you're praying for everybody around the world that you do. Enough said.
I think for me, studying the prayers in Scripture are very inspirational. The kinds, like you mentioned earlier, just the kinds of prayers that Paul especially expressed. And so I try to pray that way for different people. I find that for me, I have designated blocks of time for prayer that I specifically reserve on my calendar. But also, I just find myself crying out to the Lord when I'm driving, anytime. Prayer just feels like a natural conversation at all times, so I can't really categorize it specifically. I don't pray with lists, although I have lists to remind me, but lists, I just find myself just doing it by rote. So I just say, Lord, what should I be praying for, and things that He's laid on my heart.
I have a giant statue of the Virgin Mary that I have a time and a place that I go. It's in my basement, my little study area. I usually light a candle. I usually spend 2 minutes in quiet, thinking, presenting myself to God. And then I have a couple different prayer prompts or books that I use. Some that are straight up scripture, like Kenneth Boa, or some that'll be like a missionary's card or a little prayer notebook with names. It's kind of like a list, and I'll work through that. I often will pray the Lord's Prayer as I'm falling asleep every night, too. I don't get very far in it, but I start it.
Great.
There's a great book called Prayer Coaching by
Nicotine.
Jim Nicotine. Wow, really, really good book that gives you all kinds of varieties of what you can do in prayer. And we've got some of those things, I think, over at CE, and it's been really helpful. Something that kind of relates not necessarily so much just in the prayer time, but it relates to silence. See, one of the things that's unusual for me is I'm single, and because of the fact I've never been married, which is kind of a weird situation you run into. But at any rate, when I drive in my car, I almost always, like I'll be going to Philly tomorrow as I'm doing this, I will not put the radio on. I don't do anything. I'm just quiet, and I need that to recoup, to be silent, and I pray very much at that time.
Why is it so hard? Viki, let me ask you first. Your husband's a counselor and you help him do counseling. Why is it so hard to be honest about ourselves?
Sin? No, since Adam and Eve, that's just how it's been. And we always want to justify ourselves. We want to find ways to escape from having to do the hard thing. And so it's just hard for us to recognize and acknowledge what's really going on inside us.
Someone wrote, rationalization is the best human skill there is. You think that's true?
Oh.
That we can always rationalize why we did that.
Yes.
Trump always has an answer about his mean tweet. Or someone else's. I'm not taking sides. It's awful, the example in Washington, both sides. But we're all aware of pastors falling and then people in our churches falling. Most of them knew beforehand they were going to be in trouble. But they wouldn't admit it to themselves or someone.
I think something that helps me is occasionally you have to ask yourself the question. Every year I go away at, here again, Christmas time. I don't have a lot of family, so I would normally go down to South Florida, South Padre Island. It's beautiful. Here you go, and the water and all the rest of it. But I go down with a number of books, and I set up goals, and I set up prayer times, and I ask God, what do you have me to do? And am I growing this year over where I was last year? And what have I changed in my life? And I set up goals for myself. I had to develop a purpose statement for my life. And I just said, what are my financial goals? What are my relational goals? What are my mentoring goals? What are my things that I'm doing exercise-wise? What am I doing on this kind of stuff? And that helps me if I evaluate my life. It's hard for us to evaluate and to rationalize. We always do. And I'm definitely not perfect, but I just feel like that helps me to say, and you know what? I want to finish well. One of the things, I think a lot of people start out the race and they never really finish well. I think Francis Chan is the one who I heard use the story of the illustration of marathon runner. And he says, you know what, if you're going to run a marathon, you don't come out, start the race at full speed. He said, you actually pace yourself so that as you get to the finish line, you're really giving everything you have so that you can cross the line and hear God say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And that's what I think he said, what we've done is we've done everything wrong. We get younger people that'll be all involved in ministry, and then once you get married, you slow up. Then you have kids and you slow up more. Then by the time you're retired, there's nothing left to give. You even forget you're in a race. And he said, we're doing it all wrong, and I want to really make a difference in my life. And I think that's a great example for me, and I like that.
Tim?
One of the things with self-analysis, too, is I think a lot of times we're our own worst critics, which sometimes we're not honest and we bloat our own ego, and then other times we're our own worst critic. I think that self-criticism, when done in front of other people, is often to solicit pity, and so they give us the attaboy, the pat on the back. The other challenge is we can be very selective in the kind of feedback that we hear from other people. We'll wait till our best sermon and say, what'd you think of that sermon? And they'll say, oh, or we'll know it was kind of a rotten sermon, but the one guy who always says, good sermon, Pastor, is the person who defines, if that's what we're looking for in evaluation. It's ironic to me if I know, again, it'll be a sermon. If I stunk on a sermon, it was unclear, I missed my point, and I'll know it, and I'll say to my wife, I didn't feel very good about that sermon. And if she says, yeah, it wasn't very good, I'll be frustrated, like, how dare you say that? Even though I've just admitted it, hearing it from someone else affirmed is just harder. So some of it's fear, some of it's sin, some of it's we kind of bounce back and forth between a bloated ego and self-pitying. And I think it's just learning to trust that we've done what we could before the Father, and He is happy with our efforts, even if it wasn't a perfect pitch performance.
To support everything you've said, when the prophet Jeremiah said, "The heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it?" His answer to that question was only God. God, the next word was God. Test the heart. I don't think we can really know ourselves, except to get into the Word and all that. Questions you have? You move your hand. You moved your hand. You have a question? Great. Anybody else?
Here.
Questions for the panel? I have a couple more, but or to Tim about something he said. Incidentally, related to self-analysis, this is mainly about preaching, so forgive me, but fully 75-80% of the guys that I have asked, and I do workshops and I coach right now 13 churches, fully 70, 80, maybe more, have never, ever had somebody look at one of their sermons and give them a critique. And I think that's an easy way to get a friend. And in the cohorts we have from D-Min, we have them analyze each other's. But I think that's true about life. If you're not with someone who will tag you out, I know our wives will or our husbands, but even they sometimes don't feel free to. I'm talking professionally about sermons, but even in accountability, somebody that could say, you know, you come off smart aleck or egocentric, or in a sermon, you know, you never move at all, you never smile, you never. Anyway, we need, for your subject today, we need to have input and be careful about ourselves. Other questions you have for Tim? Anybody? Anything else that stuck out? You two or anybody in the room? Yes?
Can I have a question? Like, if I feel like I'm an adolescent Christian, and so when I attend Winter to Grace Brethren, so Pastor Kip there is one of the preachers, and
Analyze one of his sermons.
I really appreciate what I'm learning in the church. But how, like, because I feel so adolescent that I don't know enough, how would I even approach, not that I have approached some of our pastors to say, you know, your topic today really spoke to me, but if there's something that I'm not fully clear on, how is it that I'm going to approach the pastor and ask, you know, or give that, if it's a critique or whatever, like, how would you look to say, okay, she doesn't really know much, but I'll you know, engage with this conversation, but really kind of pass it off. But, you know, what are some suggestions, or what are?
I should let Kip answer that since
Yeah.
he's your pastor,
Let's
and
ask-
maybe we will. But
Let's ask Kip what he wishes somebody would do. Serious.
Yeah, so fortunately we have a practice of this because we have a speaking team. So every Thursday morning our speaking team meets, and the first thing we do is do a little bit of a review and a critique. So we're used to it. So we do what you just said, is I require each person to have watched their sermon before they come, and we ask, what did you think about it? And then we give input. So we've developed a little bit of a thicker skin on that. So I would just say, if you have a thought, come walk down the hallway, knock on the door, come in and share it. Because fortunately we're not going to respond in defensiveness, because we've already trained ourselves to be able to accept that kind of thing.
You would love an email asking a content question, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, sure. Clarification, what did you mean by this? I don't understand this. Or this is something that's distracting. That would only be helpful.
Yeah.
This is a completely different topic, but maybe there's a connection between these two thoughts. I don't know why it sprang into my mind. But people leave, they leave the church, and they're really afraid to tell, and they're afraid to explain. I always think, oh man, I'd love to know. I know it hurts that you go, but it would be so much more helpful if you would say why, because I can learn from that, and we can Same thing with that. If our communication is failing in some way, it's much better to learn what that is. It's helpful information.
Good. And tell what your wife said to you the other night about leaving the church. I know that was confidential.
Don't get better.
That was confidential, I know, but we've all heard the joke about the guy who gets up, doesn't want to go to church. He said he hates the sermons. And, honey, you gotta go. You're the pastor.
It was terrible because one thing she said was, Tim's so much better looking.
Moving on.
Can I address that question too?
Yeah, please.
I battle back and forth with expectations about the sermon. I think one sermon does very little in the life of a human being, of a Christian, but I think a whole series of sermon builds you up, and it fights back against what the world is pushing in your direction regularly. So I don't expect regularly at the end of a sermon to say, that changed my life. But it gives you a little food for thought or a little encouragement along the way. I would love to hear that. So when someone sends me an email, I would much rather hear or get an email that says, hey, this made me think about this, or I'm not sure I agree with it. I would rather hear someone say, I'm not sure I agree with that, because at least you're thinking, than good sermon pastor. Good sermon pastor is meaningless, really. So an email is a fairly informal way to do it. I did have one lady tell me, do you know how often you say you guys? You want to know how many times you said it last sermon? And I didn't want to know. And I didn't need the actual count of how many. That's not helpful to me. So that one was like, but if it's more related to content or what it's making you think, or a question, how do I live this out? I think any pastor would welcome further discussion, whether it's through email or in the hallway or something like that. So ask it. That's encouraging to us.
And a conversation is always wonderful. Anonymous notes, no thank you.
Don't even read it. Yeah. Good. One time I pushed a group of teenagers. It was between services, and I was going to go back and do it again. And I was just having fun with them and walked in the middle, and we all laughed. And one guy yelled, 16 times. And I wanted to go to the bathroom for the next service. You always go to the bathroom for each service. We used to have 5 of them. Anyway, I walked back and said, 16 times what? And he said, last Sunday you said yo. Or no, 16 Sundays in a row you said yo. Are you going to say it today? So people do take notes. And so I made sure I said yo that Sunday. Any other questions for the panel or for Tim?
Let me mention something that I'm always concerned about. Maybe this is not fully addressing it. I think sometimes we put too much of an emphasis on what happens in church on Sunday. And I think we saw it when we were looking at the scriptures. Teach yourself to be godly. I think we have a responsibility to grow spiritually. I do not look at is the responsibility of anybody else except me. I need to be growing and I need to be changing. If my church is not giving me whatever I need, it's still my responsibility to grow. And I have a responsibility to change in my life. And it's not, and I learned that from a friend of mine. His name was Jean-François, and he was from over in France. And he said, I live in a community. He said, there's not even one evangelical church in my community. And I go to a Catholic church on Saturdays, and I sit there because I have responsibility to grow spiritually. And I've just got to figure out how I can do that. And I thought, you know what? You're right on. And I'm a baby, because I would end up feeling like I need somebody to help me to be a motivator to do this. I don't need anybody else. The Holy Spirit's working inside my life. And I need to be responsible for my own spiritual growth. And if I'm not growing, it's my fault. It's not somebody else's.
Train yourself.
Train yourself to be godly. And that's what we went through this. And you were saying, and I thought it was a really good point, Brad was kind of with our group, and we said training means exercise. And we said bodily exercise profits little. It profits. But godliness, you have to exercise yourself. You don't want to go to church all the time. You don't want to have devotions all the time. You don't want to do this. But guess what? You've got to train yourself to be godly. And it's just like you would never think anything, well, I've got to watch what I eat, I've got to exercise, I've got to stretch or walk or whatever you're doing. But that's also, you have to do that spiritually.
If I could make a comment on that, that's one of the biggest challenges as I work with women, and I'm sure it's the same with men too. But to help them understand the necessity of discipline before the crisis comes. And I tell young women, for example, who are not married and are frustrated that they're not married, I say, this is your time to get into the Word. You have that freedom. You don't have the responsibilities. Use it to prepare yourself. Invest in your own spiritual growth. And just here at the table at lunchtime, I was talking with somebody, and the past 6 months have been extremely difficult for my family with just crisis after crisis. And she said, how do you get through it? How does it affect your spiritual disciplines? Because it has completely changed the rhythms and the way that I do things as we've just dealt with one crisis after another. But what has sustained is the years of investing in the past. And if we could only get the people in our churches to understand that. Because when things are going well, you don't feel the need for spiritual disciplines. And then when you do feel the need, it's kind of too late to really be able to take advantage of it because you're already in the crisis and you're not prepared. I work a lot with trauma care. And that's one of the things is teach them the theology of suffering before they actually get there so that they have some idea of what God is doing in the background.
Back to sermons just for a second. I think sometimes as pastors, those of us who give lessons or sermons, everyone is going to do a lot of good if you're really exposing the Word. You don't get up from every meal and say, that was the best meal I ever had. But every meal is important on your growth and your training or your physical. And every sermon over the years builds a church, and sometimes even poor ones help people. It's not the issue. I grew up in a church where you had to see results. Who will raise their hand? Or if God spoke to you today, come forward. Come on, if God doesn't speak every week, we play little games. But as pastors, we should say it's the growing effect of church and every week worship as a group. You hope to teach them how to do it privately. But it isn't like the sermon was a wonder, it's just that it was another meal. And that still makes me put all the work I can do into it and make it as best I can do. But every meal is important if you're going to be healthy.
I've heard it stated, it says, when you hear something, it's a sermon, it says it's like putting a strainer underneath the spigot. And the water comes out. And you know what? It may not hold the water, but guess what? The strainer's a lot cleaner. And I think that's a good illustration of what happens. You go through, you don't always retain what somebody taught, but you know what? You're a lot cleaner because you went through it.
Tim, you did this today all day. And just a reminder, maybe somebody comment, we're all going to work hard at sermons, and that wasn't the subject today, but the stuff Tim said today, we should also teach to our church, because many of them think a family altar is something you buy. And I would dare say that in today's world of sports and busy schedules, very few families ever pray together. And somehow we need to teach them how to do those things and how to talk at home and help them do that. Any final question? We're going to quit early, but Tim, anything you wish you would have said today that you didn't say, now that you think about it?
Oh, it was good enough. I want to say this. Jesus said, I have come that they might have life, that you might have life, and have it to the full. And I think the picture that he paints, that the Apostle Paul and the other writers of the New Testament are fleshing out, is a life of fullness and joy and love and peace that would rock the world. And the reason we do this, care for our souls, is we want to be so full of that life that it spills out of us. We don't want to be walking wounded or defeated when Jesus has made a different promise to us. That doesn't mean there aren't times where we don't limp and God uses our weakness. He does. But he came that we might have life and have life to the full. And I'd love for Christian leaders to be a picture of that, the fullness of life.
in last week's Christianity Today online, Beth Moore, who's a famous woman speaker from Dallas, I think Dallas, Southern Baptist down there, and a gorgeous woman, responding because of falls of giants, said, build 5 fences, but the 2 that stuck out to me were, I never trust myself, first one. And she seems to be a strong believer. And the second one was, I never trust anybody else. And you know what she meant. She didn't mean, it's not paranoia, it's just, you don't let yourself be alone with people. You don't trust yourself or them, what they might say. And the third one, she had 5, you ought to look at it, but one was a fiery family. And I think that's the adjective she used, fiery family, but she said, we're hard on each other and we love each other. And, all that was what you said today, too. I would like to close with thoughts from the audience. I just 5 of them. I don't care if there's 4, but on Billy Graham. He was my hero. I'm sure he was for many of you, or at least for John and me, anybody over 45. If you saw his funeral and if you heard people talk about him, let's say he had his problems and warts, I don't know what they are, because he was my hero and my dad, he was my dad's hero. They were contemporaries. My dad wanted to go into ministry and he flunked, but he always watched Billy Graham. What are some things we could learn from his life before we close with prayer? Just in a sentence. Sorry to spring that on you, but I think we've all thought about it. John?
I think he had godly character his whole life. I remember I was probably about 10 or 11, Sandy Cove Bible Conference in Maryland, Northeast Maryland. And his number 2 man came, Leighton Ford, and he said that Billy Graham had been approached by Arrow Shirt Company, and they said if he would wear an Arrow shirt, he would never have to buy another shirt. It was like, as a 10-year-old, I thought, wow, wouldn't that be great? And he, of course, Leighton said he had to turn it down. It just wasn't a temptation. So from at least that age, 10, I just thought, this man really did something special and right.
One of the moving things, excuse me, his kids thought he was faithful. If your kids think you're faithful, it's important.
I also heard he was over in England and stayed in a motel room where they had televisions in it, and the televisions themselves had porn on it. And he said, I want to let you know, I don't want to be tempted to watch pornography in there. So would you please make sure that is not available to me? And they said, I'm sorry, we can't do that. That's just a part of our, it's part of our television. And he went in and he got a knife and he ripped the cord out. And he said, don't want to be tempted.
Wow.
That was a good story of saying, I'm not going to sin.
He was a good example of the message never changing, but they were innovative in their time with television and music and all kinds of things. So they were willing to engage the culture and be innovative, but he was saying the same gospel at the end that he was saying at the beginning. And so you see that continuity of message, but willingness to try to get that message across in different ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. I listened to a sermon in the car and I counted 13 times he said, the Bible says. Fly that past a lot of churches that never open it or just use it as a diving board. Now, you don't have to say it like he did. He just was famous. The Bible says. But he got it from there. Simple as it was. Pardon?
The buses will wait.
I've always said that. And they said, Pastor, we don't use buses anymore. But they'll wait. You can come down from the balcony. Anyway, if you saw the funeral, the memorial, or ever go through his museum, you just see faithfulness. And God is the one who dispenses talents and availability or privilege like he had, and we all have a tiny one. But if I'm faithful in the tiny one I have, and you are in yours, you will stand in line next to the pastor from Portis, Kansas, who, how many live there, Kip?
Yeah.
100? Serious, if he's faithful, Kip's grandfather, is it your grandfather pastored there? I've often used it as an example. I just say it because I love Kip and it's fun to say it in front of him, but that guy will be right next to Billy Graham, and my grandmother will be right there, who never gave a public speech but was faithful, and we will all be if we're faithful. Tim, thank you so much. This was very helpful.